Welcome to Nasdaq Trade Talks. I'm Jill Malandrino, global markets reporter at Nasdaq. Joining me for this segment, we have Jonathan Victor, head of NFTs at Protocol Labs, to discuss the future of the internet and what Protocol Labs is building. Jonathan, it's great to have you with us. Welcome to Trade Talks.
Yeah, thank you for having me. Really excited to be here.
And we're catching up after Consensus and NFT NYC. There's been so many interesting speakers, talks, and discussions. What's the community talking about right now, and how was the mood on the ground?
Yeah, I mean, so I think overall, maybe not a surprise to folks, the mood was enthusiasm. Obviously, there's volatility in the market that's brought some fear as well. But overall, the people who came to these events came because they're true believers. You see tons of expansion, whether it be from gaming, people talking about ticketing, just different use cases for NFTs and this technology. I would argue we're sort of at this point where people have seen that there's a there. And so as a result, people are much more excited about, in this opportune time, not to focus on numbers and where they're going, but more about how do we build the fundamentals and keep pushing forward use cases.
I noticed the same thing too. It wasn't so much about the value of said coins, but really, all the different projects that were being worked on. So let's talk about that in simple terms. Can you explain what the future of the internet means to Protocol Labs and what you're building?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the way to think about this, blockchains give us this tool to allow many untrusting parties to coordinate, and there's many ways that you can use them. In Filecoin's case, we actually use this to basically aggregate data center capacity to offer what looks like an Airbnb for storage. So if you are a company or a business or a nonprofit, you can now, instead of just going to a single cloud provider or a small oligopoly of cloud providers, you can go to this open market where you can get the cheapest price of storage possible because it's a market rate without worrying about lock-in or being locked into one specific vendor or things like that. And as a result, we're able to see things like in the last 2 years, the storage network grow from 0 to over 17 exabytes of storage capacity. That's about 17 Netflix archives or 170 CERNs in terms of storage capacity at a price point that's less than 1% of Amazon's S3 Glacier infrequent access. So really what we're looking at is seeing sort of this like network effect and this market growth, delivering both scale and a price point for storage that we don't see in the traditional cloud providers.
A lot of your work centers around NFTs and gaming. How do you think about NFTs, and how can we think of them as something more than just digital collectibles?
Yeah, so I like to call NFTs digital bearer objects. So if you remember like old-timey stock certificates, it was like whoever owns the certificate is the owner. Well, NFTs allowed us to do that with digital objects on the web. And while we've had digital objects, people have bought skins in Fortnite, we haven't had objects which are owned by users that can be taken across platforms. And so I think the early use cases that people have sort of gravitated to, maybe they're the art use cases, now more recently these game use cases, I think these are interesting and they lead with these new primitives, new experiences that can be built, but we really haven't seen people tap into this idea of users bringing data around the web. So a canonical example I like to use is, what if a user was to bring their personal data into these different websites where now you can selectively reveal which properties you want to show to the website, rather than saying like the website is going to ask you to enter a bunch of personal information, you've now thrown it all over a wall and you have no ability to cut off access in the future. And I think this is the sort of paradigm that NFTs can potentially unlock.
So perfect segue to the next question. Why is decentralization in Web3 so important when it comes to storing humanity's most important information?
Yeah, so I would say there's like probably a few ways of looking at this. One is about user control. I would argue this is maybe the more philosophical of like what doesn't work in the web today. And I would argue when you start thinking about things at scale, it really only makes sense when you start thinking in terms of users first, just because we have so many different types of people on this planet with different values, different beliefs. And without having decentralization, you're trying to create with a monolithic set of rules to apply to everyone, which just seems unsustainable. The other side, though, is resiliency. This is just a much more practical concern. It would be terrible if one hurricane or one earthquake or one outage somehow took down the entire internet. We rely on things, or we rely on the internet for so much. And we've seen this every now and again when some of these major cloud providers have an outage and half of the US's websites stop working. Like, this is incredibly bad for businesses. And I would argue it's just more of an issue for people who are trying to run their businesses. And so, yeah, I would say decentralization offers both in terms of like the philosophical as well as just the practical, more resiliency and security for folks.
And finally, Jonathan, one of the things people are talking about now is blockchain's environmental impact. Can you talk to me about Protocol Labs movements here?
Yeah, so this is one of the things that's actually kind of amazing about blockchains. The way Filecoin works, we actually have an incredible amount of transparency into the energy consumption of the network. So if you look at how ESG is typically done, people are aggregating self-reported statistics from companies that are sort of filling out surveys saying, this is what our energy impact is, but it's really hard to verify some of those claims. When you're using these transparent ledgers, we can now actually look on Filecoin's chain and come up with, well, here's the upper bound of energy estimations that we can make based on what we see you doing on the network. And now we can verify your claims of cleanliness against what the network is telling us, like you are doing. So if you're saying I'm sourcing 100% renewable energy, well, I want to see REC's renewable energy certificates that map to the energy consumption that the network is showing that you are implicitly consuming. And so I think it leads to maybe a more auditable and more verifiable statement about how clean these operations are, which is actually quite unique and makes it easier then to start working towards solutions. So Protocol Labs, we're doing a lot to help support an initiative in our ecosystem called Filecoin Green, where our goal is to basically turn the Filecoin network to be net zero. And it's not something that people should have to take our word for. It's a claim that we can make, and we can provide the data for anyone to inspect and drill all the way down into each individual node to see, well, for the energy consumption of this data center, where is the REC that maps against that? So I'm incredibly bullish, especially for what crypto can offer in a way that the traditional web just can't.
All right, Jonathan, appreciate the insight. Thanks for joining us on Trade Talks. I'm Jill Malandrino, Global Markets Reporter at Nasdaq.
Thanks for having me.